This week, we welcome Guillaume Ross, Chief Information Security Officer from Synaptic, to discuss his first year building a security program from scratch at a startup. In the leadership and communications section, who actually owns cybersecurity? CISO versus CIO. How to say no after saying yes. Decode different types of business interruption insurance and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Cybersecurity is about more than just technology. It's about how people behave with emails, data, and cloud applications that directly impacts your company's security posture. Security works best when it's ingrained in the culture of your organization. To learn how to build a security culture and transform your employees from targets into a strong line of defense, head to securityweekly.com/proofpoint and visit their Cybersecurity Awareness Center. Cyber risk and compliance automation is finally here. Legacy GRC systems cannot support the powerful, real-time automation and oversight that organizations require to take risks that matter to succeed. CyberSync continuous control automation ingests data from the IT GRC stack to update controls against regulatory requirements and risks in real time, delivering insights and visibility. See how members of the Fortune 500 are saving millions annually by visiting securityweekly.com/cybersync. Every 11 seconds, there's a new ransomware attack. Oil pipelines, universities, corporations, all paying millions of dollars. Barracuda says, don't pay the ransom. Before a ransomware attack occurs, train your teams to recognize an attack and use anti-phishing technology. Protect your applications, and they can't get onto your network. Simple backup and restore solutions quickly recover your data without paying the ransom. Build your ransomware protection plan now by visiting securityweekly.com/barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/barracuda.
Weekly. This is episode number 233, recorded September 27th, 2021. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado. Joining remotely are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, Matt. Week 3 of the NFL, and you know what I learned? Your Broncos are killing it. Pats need an offense. Ben Roethlisberger, he needs to retire. And holy crap, did you see that Justin Tucker kick? 66 yards,
6
man.
yards.
Insane.
Yeah, it was an interesting weekend of football. The Browns did well, but then they were playing the Jets, so it didn't really matter because the Jets are just so bad. that bodes well for New England, I guess, in the division, except for the Bills are good. But the Broncos, they just, oh my gosh, they just keep going. It's awesome.
They're killing it.
Yeah. Also joining me remotely is Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Matt. How's it going? Glad to be here again.
Glad to have you. InfoSec World 2021 is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's event. Hear from Robert Hirkovic, plus heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Plus, Security Weekly listeners save 20% on the digital pass registration. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 to register now. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher, our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and follow us on our newest live streaming platform, Twitch. Guillaume Ross has worked in security for way too long by now. He's been a defender, a consultant, managed blue teams, and is now CISO at Synaptic, building security from scratch in an environment where it is critical. Guillaume, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Hi, nice to see you. I hope I don't need any football knowledge to be on the show because you're probably going to kick me out pretty fast.
Yeah, so this crew is kind of football. Like my boss is soccer, and that might translate well into Canada a little bit. I mean, maybe a little football.
More of a baseball guy, so.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good. It's good. Guillaume, this discussion is really interesting to me because you are about 55 weeks into your role as a CISO at a brand new startup. And not many people get to start from scratch. Because when you think about it, let's see, I have no security program, no security culture, no technical debt. I pretty much have nothing. So where do you start?
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, it's pretty rare for a startup to hire a security team or even a single security specialist from the beginning. It really has to be a startup where security is going to be extremely important for that to make sense. I think for many startups, it actually would make more sense to have someone on a retainer as a consultant, here and there, but maybe not someone full time. We've been 2 full-time security employees at Synaptic since the company was less than 2 months old. And as you say, you don't have anything, right? So you've got to start with things you never really thought you would get to help decide as a CISO in a company. Basic things like, are we going to support Mac or Windows or both of them? And what language are we going to pick to build our backend? And what cloud environment, what cloud vendor is it going to run on? You get to make these decisions from the beginning, which it's great because you get to pick what you want and build it the way you want. And then you don't get the excuse or maybe the downside, which is you always think it would be easier if you'd done this properly in the beginning, which it is true for many things. But there's also a lot of stuff that's pretty hard to bootstrap.
Yeah, I mean, Jason, just think about this for a second, right? How many times you get to pick the technology?
Oh my God,
stack,
greenfield, right? Open canvas. I mean, I was the first CISO, first security leader for 2 different IT professional services, managed services organizations. And, one of the first things in both instances I had to tackle was know what I have. And that was probably one of the most difficult pieces to figure out, right? And then start doing risk classifications against it. What's legacy? What's end of support? What's end of sale? And just really ripping through the assets, finding where the data is, finding all those nooks and crannies in the organization. Open canvas, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. It is awesome. And then you get to spend time on different things or different challenges, right? Like, for example, do you start doing code reviews when the company is 1 month old, right? How much of a hit on productivity will that be versus what's the benefit going to be once you're 1 year in? And that's something that we're very, very strict on. We've established that as a policy really early on. And then we realized that having these types of things enforced as policy as code, right? Like the kind of things and processes that you just can't bypass because that's your way of working, right? Like you're working on code, someone needs to review it, 2 people need to review it, or you're changing encryption settings, a security team needs to review it. By enforcing that from the beginning, it turns into a culture after not that long. People get used to it, then the new employees that you onboard, they start working with the rest of the team, and it just becomes the new normal. And I find that you have to spend a lot less time on these things and these different arguments. And it makes a huge benefit down the road. We're already seeing it, 1 year down the road. And as you were saying, for knowing what you have, that's another big advantage of starting from scratch, but also starting from scratch in a remote, all cloud world, right? Like if something is not listed by the cloud vendors APIs, we don't have it unless it's maybe a laptop, which then is listed by our MDM, right? There's literally no piece of hardware that exists somewhere that I can't know we have through a few API calls. And that's something I really wished I had very often in many jobs before.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I sit back and I look at it. You're literally embedding security into the DNA of your organization out of the gate, right? So it becomes part of the culture, it becomes part of the habit and what people are doing within their jobs on the day to day. But it's also future-proofing you and allowing you to be scalable later on. I kind of came from the opposite end of the spectrum of trying to take an enterprise-level organization who didn't have a security program or security team, and then you try to turn the ship. And it's hard to win hearts and minds, and it's hard to ingrain culture into 26 years of history of doing things a certain way.
Yep.
And winning those hearts and minds, that was a good portion of probably my first year. Putting my foot in the door is just gaining trust.
Yeah, culture is such a hard thing, right? I mean, we all struggle with that. I think that's one of the most challenging parts of the job is just trying to figure out how to get the culture shifted, especially in an organization where there hasn't been security, right? I had a similar experience to Jason where, I came into an organization, 60 years old, the first CISO, right? They've never had a CISO before in 60 years, publicly traded company. And you think, how did you get by, right? With no people, no process, no technology. So being able to, I think, get in front of that and get the culture is just such a phenomenal jump start to the right, way to run a program.
Yeah, it's definitely a much different type of environment. But then you also have a set of different challenges that come with. You're an early company. You don't really have customers yet, right? Like your company was literally created 2 weeks ago, and I think that balancing productivity and security becomes even more important there than in enterprise, for example, because I think the top risk for a lot of startups is just not getting customers, not getting funding, and not existing anymore, and that you don't have anything to protect. Yeah. That being said, there's so much automation that's available now that if you focus on a few tools and automating the processes, then you cut down on how much you need to document because the process is automated and enforced, so people can't really go around it, so they'll learn how to do it. And I think one thing that's really key is you really want to pick a few vendors and use them as much as you can. So for example, if you're looking at, let's say AWS, Azure, GCP, they're all pretty good. Notice I didn't mention many other cloud vendors there when I said they were all pretty good. And between those three, they all have a lot of different security features for logging. Their access management is super granular and all of that. But you're not going to have a team of 20 people to manage that in a month or in 2 months. And so you really need to be sure that it's a mistake, I think, in enterprise to buy too much stuff and not use it enough. And you end up with, shelfware, things used at like 5% of their capacity, and then you end up paying for it and it increases your attack surface a lot. Well, you just don't have that benefit in like a pre-funding, like a pre-Series A company. It's just not going to happen. And that forced focus makes you design things that are just better.
Yeah, you have an interesting environment. So when I was at Tenable, when I was doing the strategy work there back in 2016 timeframe, I came up with this model that said, if everything moves to the cloud, what's left for me to manage, right? Maybe my mobile device or my a laptop, a Wi-Fi access point, and that was it, right? That's basically what you have. Like, I was kind of hypothesizing this is where the world could be in a few years. You're actually there. I mean, you're all up and running in a cloud environment with users remote, accessing the cloud environment through their individual devices or maybe even company-owned devices. But what does that do to the threat profile? Like, what's different when everything is remote and has to connect into this cloud infrastructure? Because not many people have to do that.
I think the first thing is, if you're a company that makes what we're doing at Finaptic, this is not a product pitch, but just so you understand the risk profile that goes with that, is we're building APIs that people can use to create their own banking products and offer them. So for example, if you were a major retailer and you wanted to have like a checking account, you could use our APIs and offer that through your website, and we handle all the stack, regulatory, technical, everything. So we're essentially a cloud provider of our own. It's banking accounts as a platform, banking products as a platform, I should say. So in our case, that lets us focus more on what we're building, the security of the code that we're building. However, we're using a lot of features in cloud environments that are actually pretty complex, and you need the time to focus on using those securely. Where you can pick managed offerings, in most cases, that's going to be a good trade-off. If you're a company using the cloud, especially if you're not a service provider building IT solutions for other companies. But in some cases, you'll just have needs that are too complex. You can't just use what's out of the box, and you still end up building something that's a little bit more complex in the cloud. But then you can really focus on what's more important. And I think one of the main advantages of the cloud is, unlike, say you have an existing company that's using maybe multiple clouds, data centers, got a bunch of network devices, servers, and everything else. Just something as simple something that should be as simple as access management, which is definitely not that simple in enterprise. You've got 62 places where that actually happens, and that's 62 places for increased attack surface and mistakes. Whereas if you're all in with a cloud vendor like AWS or GCP, you don't have a router somewhere that's controlled with some weird radius server somewhere. It's all in the same IAM. The downside is that IAM is extremely granular and extremely complicated as well. So there's trade-offs, but I think you can definitely make better use of your engineers to build a platform that's going to be reliable and secure, because you're not worrying about hardware and everything else, right? Like you're not running your own OpenStack and your own Kubernetes and all of that.
Now, Guillaume, I know I dealt with this a lot. At my previous organization, we had 35 of the Fortune 100 who were our clients. How does migrating all cloud help from a vendor risk management perspective? Because I know from our on-prem, because we were hybrid, obviously, right? We had a lot of on-prem, a lot of gear that we owned, data centers, all over the country, and vendor risk management in our audits were extremely complicated, especially from our regulated customers. Moving to the cloud and moving to some of the best of the breed in out there. How does that help? Does it hinder? Does it make it more complicated? How does that work for you?
Well, I think in our case, we're a cloud provider, and there's no way we can offer what we do as on-prem. Like it's just not possible from a business model point of view, but from a everything point of view, right? Like we run the stack for people that can't have access to the stack themselves, right? They use our APIs. I've worked for cloud vendors that had both options. And I would say it's much simpler when you only have to worry about running in one of the two environments. The downside, I would say, is, for example, if you're a security vendor, I've worked for a variety of different security vendors, there's still a lot of resistance to necessarily having to send the data to the cloud or sending or giving privileges to cloud instances. But that's fading away pretty fast. And I would say the main difference is just that the threat profile is completely different, and you've got to be worried more about things that happen in real time, how the data is secured, and be sure you have a pretty good level of confidence with your vendors. Whereas if it's on-prem, you still need to have that same level of confidence with the vendors, right? Because ultimately you're going to take code that they've written and run it in your own environment, but you might be able to put a few different controls around it. That's not really the environment that we're in. We cannot provide that on-prem. So what we're trying to do is build the environment that's the safest that we can make it, so that our customers are very confident that by using our solution, their data is as secure as possible. And that includes being very transparent with them, explaining exactly how we protect XYZ, right? Like for a lot of things, it's like encryption. The secret should be the key, not the algorithm. And I think the same is true for protecting cloud environments. You should be open about what you're doing. That shouldn't be what's protecting the data your customers trust you with.
Yep, and be upfront with any limitations that the vendor may have in compensating controls you put in place, right?
Yeah.
Guillaume, you're in an interesting environment. You're in the financial space, which is highly regulated here in the States and in Canada and pretty much anywhere in the world. What does that do? I mean, when you think about it from a regulatory perspective, how do you account for things like regulatory compliance and some of the regulatory stuff? Have you just integrated that all in from the security program, like up front, so that there aren't like, I think about the old banking system, right? You had a chief risk officer, maybe a chief compliance officer. You had a chief security officer. You had a lot of structures. I don't think you have that, do you? I mean, you've streamlined this pretty well.
Well, we do have a head of regulatory compliance because of the space that we're in, and that touches a lot of stuff that's not necessarily even technical. For example, consent is very important in banking applications, right? And the way you store who consented to what is extremely important. And privacy is also something we think is super important. And we have someone running a team dedicated to that. And of course, we work together a lot because if you can't protect the information, then it's never going to be private, right? That being said, there's a huge advantage to being able to do policy and infrastructure as code, because it lets you prove what you're doing very easily, and it lets you control changes very easily, right? Like if everything is a Git commit and then a PR, and you can see who approved what and changed what, that really will help you with these different audits and regulatory compliance. And I find that the best way to approach that is do security as well as you can, and then you're going to get 75% of the regulatory stuff covered, and then everything else you just implement as needed, right? For example, if you just look at something like PCI DSS, there's a lot of stuff in there that's just a good practice. There's some stuff in there that's completely stupid. I'm thinking of password requirements, for example, but most of it you're going to do anyway, right? So if you start doing that from the beginning and everything is enforced as code, then even going through an audit is actually pretty straightforward because you have a provable audit log of all the changes that happen and of those policies being implemented. Now, the question is, how many of these policies can you actually enforce versus others that are more like manual processes and different policies that just cannot be automated? But that's the biggest win with starting from scratch is you can start with the goal of automating most of it from the beginning. And to be honest, there's a lot of overlap between all the different regulations and compliance regimes out there.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that has been one of the big challenges, I think, for larger organizations. You streamlined that pretty well by just integrating it into your program, which means your software development lifecycle, that whole flow, that CI/CD pipeline build process is critical for tracking those changes and really maintaining the audit log for you. I mean, it's all around your code, which is different than most other providers who have a lot of other legacy infrastructure to support as well.
Yeah, so early on, the first few months, that's actually what we spent a lot of time on, was building all the tooling that we need to run our solution. So CI/CD, obviously a big part of that. And that's where you start putting in the checks, right? Oh, you don't fulfill XYZ, you can't make it even to dev. And then you make it to dev. What do you need to make it to pre-prod or prod? Knowing that the goal is to be deploying very, very often, right? So we're not going to have like a change management review board that meets once a week to approve things that are going to be done on the week with 4 Thursdays or whatever. And so you get to design that from the beginning, but you also only have one thing you're really working on, right? It's not like you're working for a company that's made 16 acquisitions in the last 5 years and has like 100 different products built with different technologies, completely different. And so you can make sure that the entire company follows the same processes. And then it becomes a matter of enforcing things in the pipeline and then making it easy for people to have that as close to them as possible. So for example, if you're implementing, like something that's really good to do from the beginning is just static application security scanning, right? Mm-hmm. You do that from the beginning. People get used to the idea. If you have a process for managing exceptions and false positives, that just becomes a new way of working. And you start when you have 0 lines of code, it's not going to be a huge pain in the butt. If you start when you have 10 million lines of code, that's going to be a big project. And you want to enforce that in that pipeline, but at the same time, make that available to the engineers so they can run it on their own side, so they'll know if they made a mistake before they push it in, right? Like that sounds obvious to anyone who's implementing any of that, but now you have the added benefit of doing that at the beginning of the company, so everyone has started doing it from the beginning, and that becomes ingrained in the culture, right? And as new people start working here, they just see that, okay, here's how the build pipeline works, the different checks we have before things can go to production, and it's just the new normal, and that lets you focus on then the more advanced stuff. But you're right. Then the CI/CD, I think, is the critical attack surface for a lot of cloud vendors, right? That's if you can get into the CI and you can just insert a script there. That's why I think the CodeCov vulnerability and I think breach from April or March was very interesting because a lot of people loaded that tool straight on their CI environment. And I think mitigating the risk to your CI environment becomes very, very critical. And a lot of companies have started using these tools a lot without necessarily realizing that it's the new keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, it's just like this shift of where the attack surface is now in your CI/CD pipeline, the open source programs and projects that you're using. But here's the beauty. Because you've integrated static analysis, software composition analysis, vulnerability scanning, et cetera, right? Automated it in the pipeline, you see it. You can detect it. You can address it right away instead of waiting. Oh, it's time for the monthly vulnerability scan. Let's go out and scan our network and see what comes back. I mean, you're doing it real time, which definitely has an advantage.
Yeah, the goal is definitely to do things real time and block when something doesn't meet whatever requirement. Of course, you still need to do some checks after that because something could be discovered after the fact or whatever. But I think a key part of that, if we're talking about libraries and everything that makes up what you're building, your bill of material, if you want, when you get to pick the technology you're going to be using, that's something that you can have a pretty big impact on. So, for example, I'm not going to name names, but Some languages have some package managers where there's a lot of libraries to do very, very minor things, right? Like you want to compare two numbers, let's go get an open source library to do that. And those typically have millions of packages, and then there's vulnerabilities all the time. Other languages, it's not as bad, but there's no guarantee. So from the beginning, if you can build that graph of dependencies that you have and start tracking that, that's going to give you a huge advantage. And it's so much easier to do at the beginning than to do once you're like 7-8 years in and you've got a million different things, right? Like that graph, it can still fit on a screen. You don't need a 52-inch plotter to print it out.
I'm just giggling inside, knowing the history of all the different things that we've had to try to fix over the years.
Yeah.
I think Ben's back. Ben, I wanted to give you a chance to ask Guillaume any question, because this was like right in your wheelhouse, baby.
Yeah. So look, I'm just interested, when you think about, taking a program from the start like this in a real greenfield, where do you come out on the balance between security, sitting in the typical, security organization under a CISO infrastructure, or, how do you align that into, some organizations that want it to sit more in the dev? How did you come out on that? And how did you factor in the balance of, that security?
Yeah, I don't think having a huge security team is a recipe for success in this type of organization. I think it's much more important to have very good security skills in the engineering teams, in the being like developers or DevOps, as well as even distributed into the product teams, right? Like threat modeling needs to start with the product team. And so that's what we're doing. We're delegating security skills in different teams, making sure that we're well covered everywhere. And then by enforcing a lot of stuff in process, we're making sure that everyone learns, as we go. So for example, people get used to doing threat modeling when there's new features coming on. Well, then the business people start being able to do threat modeling, not necessarily for like the technical aspects, right? Like, oh, we should do fuzzing on this because what if someone can inject whatever? But there's a lot of security that's just misuse of business process vulnerabilities and different things like that. So I think the key to success is to have a security team that's more worried about getting everyone else up to speed, as well as, of course, policy and monitoring and incident response. But really having more security skills in other teams is the most important. And that's why sometimes I see these numbers like, oh, there's 3 million security jobs that need to be fulfilled. And I wonder where the numbers came from. But also I think it would be much more valuable to everyone if everyone working in engineering, if you're a DevOps, if you're a developer, if you had more security skills, I think you can make much more of an impact than you've all seen these security teams with 1,000 people on them, right? These companies still get breached, right? Because why is there 1,000 people in security? Because there's so many different business units, and there's a lot of people that are a few levels disconnected from what's actually happening. And then you suddenly have a lot of overhead that is needed due to the organization that you have, but doesn't mean the result is going to be great. So so I'm not one that would wish that I had a team of 1,000 people in 5 years. I would much rather wish that we had the best developers and DevOps people in general.
Yeah, I think the alignment with the business is so much more important, right? And that's what I think you're talking about, is really making sure that you're driving security into the business for the areas that are responsible for it, and that oversight, or making sure that they're complying with policy and strategy and direction is really a lot more important. So it sounds like you've kind of taken the right direction.
It's really to get to the point where like security is just a facet of quality. Like it can be a disaster if there's a problem, but when you think about it, like a bug is a bug and a problem is a problem. And once that becomes part of the culture, it becomes much easier to have a security team that's more focused on policy and helping everyone else get up to speed. And for example, we have an application security specialist working embedded directly in the engineering team, and that brings huge returns, right? Because you can have that type of person working on the most critical code from a security point of view, but also just through osmosis of working with someone like that, everyone else levels up like pretty quickly. It's impressive.
Yeah, I think it gets back to what you talked about and what we talked about at the start. It's culture, right? If you can get the culture right from the get-go, I think it pays huge dividends, and that's where a lot of people aren't focusing. They're focusing more on the technology, not on the human and the culture side.
Yeah, and using process to create that culture, right? Because when you're starting from nothing, especially in a remote team, right? Like it's my first time working for a brand new remote company. I've worked remote before, but there is definitely something a little weird about working with a bunch of people you've never met before, because we started during the peak
Nobody's
of the
ever
pandemic.
seen each other.
Like the only person I'd seen was my boss, who brought me my laptop. And then we got set up so we would drop ship them pre-configured, and so no one saw anyone else for a while, right? And it's you have to put some effort into establishing the culture of the company in general, and security is a part of that, right? It can't just be 25 people all over the world not talking to each other and just doing their own thing.
Yeah, I like the way you equated security to quality, because in your case, the quality of your code is also the security of your code. And if you think about it that way, it's a really great analogy for people to think about when we went through the 80s with the quality assurance in the manufacturing environment. If we can do the same things in our code bases, we'll be a much more secure environment, like world, because we use so much software.
Yeah, and sometimes as technology specialists, we can think of IT security being the most important thing and security of the code. But when you're working in finance, there's a lot of security that is business process, right? Like fraud is a huge problem, and account misuse is a huge problem. I think like social networks have the same problem, where they can be misused 1,000 different ways, and traditional security teams would be like, well, there's no vulnerability. Nobody exploited anything. They just used it, and that's what happens. But you need that to be embedded, and you need the entire organization to take ownership of all these different aspects. Because at the end of the day, customers not really going to care if they lost money because of business email compromise or an actual vulnerability, or it was just like a process that wasn't good enough. It's not going to make a difference to them, and you shouldn't necessarily treat those as separate when you do things like threat modeling, for example. You should look at all different ways things can go wrong.
Yeah, and part of your success is going to be your relationships with the other executives. I mean, you talked about your compliance and regulatory officer. I'm sure you two have to have an extremely tight relationship, so that way you're apprised of everything happening within his realm. That way you can translate it back to your team.
Oh yeah. We work together all the time. Mahira, hi, if you're listening. And I think it was really important to have someone from the beginning that is really focused on these aspects, because we can already start thinking a few years down the road, right? Like what's going to happen when we have X amount of customers, or when we have these features. And by discussing these things early, you can do things like start to have an idea of what kind of resources you're going to need to build what you're going to build, right? Like as the security person, you're going to be like, oh, I want everything to be encrypted 62 times with zero knowledge, and the keys are, and okay, but why? And what's the important data? And what statements can we make to our customers saying that we're protecting the data in whichever way? And yeah, that's been a huge deal, hiring her pretty early on as well, in the first 6 months or so, I would say.
That's great. Guillaume, thank you so much for sharing your story on Business Security Weekly.
No, you're welcome. It was a blast. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.